Hi, I'm Heather Wood. I'm going to be reading to you today the first chapter of my second novel, Until We All Run Free, which was published in 2020. Chapter 1, February 25, 1866. There are those who fear the dark and the loneliness it brings, and there are those who find relief in the anonymity of the shadows. And then there are those, like Jed Young, for whom the dark is a treasured time of solace, as necessary for facing the day as lungs full of oxygen and a hot cup of coffee. In the early morning, no one was around to ask him questions, make him talk or prattle in his ears, and even in a city as big as Chicago, few outside noises disturbed his peace. This time was just for him and God, time when he could think and pray without interruption. Jed knelt on his sister's rag rug and lit the fireplace, since his snoring brother was hogging every blanket on the bed, and February in Chicago is nothing to joke about. Once flames from the kindling ignited the logs, he settled into an armchair with his sketchbook and Bible, stretching his long legs out towards the heat. The small volume in his hand had been a gift from his oldest brother, Justin, when Jed left his siblings to rejoin the Confederate cavalry in the second half of the war. It took a lot for him to get around to opening it for the first time. A year, a bullet in the shoulder, and a woman who'd unveiled the pain of his past and sent him on a search to make sense of it all. But God had used all of those things to get his attention. Jed's right hand still hung useless from his shoulder, but he could never be ungrateful for the way God had met him in that season. And now he was finally back in Chicago, having only this week reconciled with the family he had hurt so deeply. Jed put on his spectacles and read a chapter from Colossians before setting the open book on the table and reaching for his sketchbook. He flipped through it in search of the first blank page with the intention of sketching the scene before him while thinking over the words he'd just read. Halfway through the book, his eyes landed on an old sketch, and his hands instantly stilled. His second thought was recognition of how far his skill had advanced in the past 6 months of strengthening the left hand he now relied on. Art for him had begun as a tool to understanding and steadying that hand, but along the way he discovered that it also made meditation a little less intimidating. His first thought upon seeing the graphite depiction of a female visage was less a thought than a tightening in his chest. Jed was used to his chest tightening with a maddening regularity around women, but never for this reason. He'd spent most of his life avoiding females. All the logic in his brain couldn't stop the heart palpitations he experienced when crossing the path of one, with very few exceptions. His sister Kelly was one, and Alice another. It really was a poor reproduction of her. Jed could see it now. One glimpse of what was supposed to be Alice's eyes, and he was back in a row house in Philadelphia, turning away from her for the last time and walking toward the door. Kelly had said that it would get better in time. He hoped she was right, but so far only a week had passed. The pain was fresh. This, Jed thought, was exactly why he kept the past in the past. As long as he could remember, remembering had hurt, so he didn't. As long as Alice was in a sketchbook in his possession, there was the risk of being reminded of what had never been and could never be his, the real reason for the chest tightening now. Without stopping to contemplate further, Jed steadied his sketchbook with his weak right arm and ripped the page from the book. The next moment, he sat watching the flames devour his last reminder of the only woman he would ever love. That done, Jed arrived at the sought-for blank page, lifted his pencil, and glanced up at his newest muse. As usual, Jack was curled up on his stomach with his hind end in the air. 2 years had passed since Jed had last slept in the same house or even state as Jack, but the 18-year-old's sleeping habits apparently hadn't changed. An affectionate smile tugged at the corners of Jed's mouth as his pencil reproduced Jack's wavy black mop against the pillow. He had a soft spot for his rascally baby brother, a fellow Confederate and an orphan who, like Jed, had raised himself alone on the streets in North Carolina. The only other thing Jed had in common with Jack was the curly black hair that all 4 siblings shared, a gift from their Irish parents. Jack was barely 15 when Justin and Kelly came to Virginia in the middle of the war, found their younger brothers for the first time, and moved them all to Chicago. He'd only been disinterested in the things of God when Justin and Kelly tried to take them to church, while Jed had been outright opposed to it. Now, here they were, Jack in college, working his way up to seminary, and Jed unwilling to miss his early morning meetings with God. As Jed sketched and prayed, the room gradually filled with light, and Jack stirred, reaching for Jed's pillow and shoving it over his head. Soon the pillow came off again, and he groaned. "They won't go away." "What won't go away?" Jed asked, adding shading to the blankets he'd drawn. He knew Jack suffered from nightmares from his own childhood as well as the war, and assumed that was what he meant now. "Latin verbs. They're haunting me in my sleep." Jack cracked an eye open. "Since when do you wear spectacles?" "Since I found out that I can see detail better with them." "Huh. How long have you been up?" "An hour. I heard Kelly get up a few minutes ago, so the coffee should be ready soon." Jack stretched, stood up, and padded over to peek over Jed's shoulder. "Oh, for heaven's sake, I do not look like that when I sleep." Contradicting and agreeing were both activities that Jed rarely wasted his time or words on, so he mutely removed his glasses and set them on the nightstand before standing up to dress. He slid the Bible into his vest pocket and grabbed his sketchbook before following Jack out the door. "Why are you bringing that revolting picture with you?" "Oh, I haven't quite finished," Jed said, his tone casual. "I still have to add the slobber running down your chin." Jack smacked him on the shoulder, but they both knew he was enjoying this new version of his older brother. It was only yesterday that Jack came home for a short visit and found the Jed they thought was killed in the war had shown up at Kelly's earlier in the week. The old Jed was always too somber, never smiling and never understanding jokes, making him an insufferable housemate for Jack. This Jed had a light in his eyes that had never been there before. This Jed, well, Jed was still getting to know himself too. Down in the kitchen, Jed helped himself to the coffee pot just as Kelly poured the last of the pancake batter onto the griddle. He handed Jack a full mug, and together they retired to the dining room where Kelly's husband Luke already sat waiting for breakfast. An hour later, fed and combed, Jed and Jack followed Kelly and Luke up the church aisle. Although Jack stood shoulder to shoulder with Jed at 6 feet tall, his clean-shaven face and sparkling blue eyes made him look more than 2 years Jed's junior. Jed felt the eyes of the congregation on him as he made his first entrance into the church since his return. His fingers gripped the felt of his old black slouch hat, and he straightened his shoulders, trying not to think about how suffocating his black necktie felt under his beard. "Are you serious?" Jed said under his breath to Jack when he found himself once again at the front pew with Reverend Dinsmore's family. "After all these years as parishioners here, the Young family hasn't earned their own pew?" "The problem is that half of our family married the preacher's children," Jack whispered back. "I'm afraid we'll be stuck sitting in their row for the rest of our lives." "When you become a preacher, my row will be in the back, period," Jed vowed, taking his seat between Kelly and Jack. "I don't care if I'm related to the president." A moment later, movement caught Kelly's eye, and she glanced over to see Justin arrive alone and slide onto the end next to Jack. She took in his drawn face, sympathetic that Rebecca, his wife and Luke's sister, couldn't be next to him. Only a week and a half had passed since she'd lost their first baby, and it was still too early for her to be out. Jack greeted him with a hand on the back, and Justin's gaze trailed down the row until his eyes met Kelly's. She attempted a smile, but she was fighting tears already. This moment was special, and as much as she knew he wanted to be with his wife, she also knew he wouldn't have missed this for anything. Organ notes filled the church, and they stood to sing. When Jed's clear baritone floated through the air, Kelly lost any chance of hanging on to her composure. Although it had been over 2 years since all 4 siblings had stood in church together, today was the first time that Jed had come willingly, the first time that all 4 of them had ever worshipped together as believers. Tears rolled down Kelly's cheeks, and she felt Luke reach for her hand and squeeze it. She closed her eyes and let Jed's voice carry her back to their last Christmas in Kentucky when she was 5, sitting on her pa's lap and listening to him sing in that same rich baritone. If only Henry and Sinead could see their children now. We turned out all right, by God's grace, Kelly thought. Her heart spilled over with gratitude to God for the way he had carried the four siblings through their separate childhoods, bringing them back together, and in his great mercy, saving each one. This moment in church was the result of decades of heartache and prayers on her part, and she knew she would never forget it. Jed stepped into Justin's apartment that evening and shifted to the side to make space for Jack to enter behind him, as Kelly set a loaf of sweetbread on the table. Jed smelled the coffee that Justin was pouring into mugs at the stove to his right, but it was Rebecca on the couch that first caught his eye. "Welcome home, Jed." Rebecca reached to squeeze his hand as he approached. Her cheeks were flushed, but she otherwise appeared almost normal again, and her brown hair was pinned up neatly as always. "I wanted to congratulate you on your wedding last year," Jed said, taking the armchair next to her. "I never guessed you'd marry the old man, since I never saw you even talk to each other when I lived here." Rebecca and Jack both laughed, and Justin shook his head in exasperation as he handed Jed a mug. "Apparently none of us should have been surprised, Jed," Kelly said with a chuckle. "We all found out later that they'd been in love since before the war started and did a rather good job at hiding it." "Very good job, I'd say." Jed lifted his mug to his lips as a diversion and fell silent while he watched the activity around him. Justin pulled Jack to the side and was telling him something in a low voice that Kelly, slicing the bread next to them, seemed to be able to hear because she lifted her head and added something to the conversation. Luke lowered himself next to Rebecca on the couch, and she turned her head away from Jed to answer his inquiry about her health. Jed's eyes traveled up to the mantel, where an old tintype of the four young siblings stood in the center, taken shortly after their first reunion and arrival in Chicago together. Family. The concept had been a foreign one to Jed for most of his life. He had the same physical features as the others in the picture, but only 1 year of shared history with them in his conscious memory. And in some ways, that year had communicated more to him about what a family wasn't than what it was. None of them had known the first thing about how to forge one out of the splinters of their four broken hearts. Looking back, Jed saw the ugly, painful awkwardness of that year as a kind of metamorphosis, but the moment that they had begun to emerge as an organism with a spark of life in it, he had cut and run, effectively tearing the whole thing down the middle. He had left, convincing himself that simply sharing an origin with other humans was meaningless. He owed them nothing, and they owed him nothing. He was wrong, of course, because never having loved before, he didn't know what it did to a person. He didn't know how much he would miss them, or how much what happened to them mattered to him. He didn't know how long and how hard he would work to be able to return to them again. Jed sat with his eyes fixed on the picture while his senses remained acutely aware of everything surrounding him. This moment, in this tiny space, was family. Genuine concern for one another on their faces, laughter on their lips, affection in their touch. He had left before the metamorphosis was complete, and it had gone on in his absence. In fact, Jed realized, a degree of his siblings' camaraderie had been forged by his very absence and the pain they had experienced together at his hands. The regret would have stung more than it did if it weren't for Jack. Jed tilted his face slightly, allowing his younger brother into his peripheral vision. Jack was still a bit of a ruffian, but the kid had transformed. Jed watched Jack snitch a piece of Kelly's bread and ask Justin a question around a mouthful, and any remaining guilt melted away. The choices he made may have left him a stranger on the outside looking in at his own family, but Jack was obviously thriving in the center of it. They had treated Jed like family by extending to him the prodigal son welcome, extending a ready forgiveness that Jed neither deserved nor expected. God had given him the courage and confidence to finally believe that he had a place in his family. Still, how long would it take before he never felt like an outsider? Thank you for joining me for the first chapter of Until We All Run Free.